Hey everybody, welcome to the Social Value Show. I am your host, Alan, and today is our final video, the fifth video in our series on ownership and decision making in a social value enterprise. And it is actually going to be about corporate structure as well as corporate governance. I mean, these are the constitution, the framework for what a social value enterprise, and for that matter, what every other corporation is. And so there's going to be a first portion here where it's just educational. I'm going to kind of bring you up to speed on the differences of different structures. So let's just get right into that. But first things first is the most common structure when it comes to a business, at least as it relates to, let's say, a medium-sized or large-sized business, is a corporation, or in other words, a C corporation. And a C corporation is a corporation that can have a ton of shareholders. You can have a whole bunch of different financial interests. You can have founding shares. It is a standard business to operate. I would say that the main difference between a C corporation from another C corporation would be you've got C corporations that are private companies, meaning the shares that exist, the ownership of those companies that exist are not liquid. There's no market for trading, meaning if I own shares in a privately held corporation, there's really no way I'm going to sell those shares to another person. The main time that anyone sees liquidity and sells their shares in a private corporation is when that corporation is sold outright, either by acquisition or through merging with another company, or in the case of some other instances like an employee stock ownership program can purchase those shares. But liquidity is not an easy thing in a normal privately held C corporation. Now you compare that to a publicly traded corporation, a C corporation, what you find is that there is a market, meaning you can find a buyer for your shares pretty much in real time. But when you see people selling shares on the stock market, that means there's a corresponding buyer who wants to buy those shares. You can't just say you want to sell it at $12 and it sells at $12. The only time you can sell it at $12 is when there's a buyer there to buy it on the other end of that. So not to get lost in the weeds. Let's go beyond the C corporation structure, which we might go back to in a little bit. Let's talk about a B corporation or a benefit corporation. In some places there's a third-party entity called B Corp that certifies in a different realm. It's not an actual corporate structure, but it's a way of looking at the other stakeholder value that gets created in a business. But a B corporation essentially is the same as any other C corporation. As a matter of fact, we are both a C corporation and a B corporation. What a B corporation is, at least in the state of California, is a benefit corporation. Meaning, normally when you are a publicly traded company, you have a fiduciary duty. And that duty is to maximize the interests of your shareholders. But if you are a B corporation, while that maximizing the value for shareholders exists, you're allowed to and have a legal obligation to consider other stakeholders. Usually it's people, planet, etc., right? So there's a ton of B corporations out there now since this movement began in the last 10 years. But it is definitely another structure you could look at that might inform how all this stuff works. The next relevant structure is a cooperative. Now, there are a lot of different types of cooperatives, but what a cooperative essentially is, it's community ownership, right? Now, in all cooperatives I've seen, they have a philosophy of one person, one vote, which is actually my main issue with cooperatives. We'll get into that in a little bit. But when you look at the different types of cooperatives, you find typically a consumer cooperative is one kind, meaning maybe you have a publicly owned grocery store where the people who buy the groceries at that store collectively own the store. And they elect the board of directors and things happen in that democratic fashion. Very interesting way. The other cooperative model is a worker cooperative or an employee cooperative. And that one is just kind of the opposite, where the employees are the ones who own all the decision making within that company. And they really are there to make sure that the labor rights are protected and that they have say in a business. And that's a beautiful thing as well. If you look at what a social value enterprise model is supposed to be, it's supposed to be a hybrid of those things, where we are both a employee-owned or a worker-owned cooperative in that sense, and we're also a consumer-owned cooperative. There are a few companies out there that are a hybrid as well, and I really, really advise taking a look at patronizing those companies and supporting them, because they are pretty much as close to being a social value enterprise as you can get, minus all this impact that we're looking to have. The last structure that is relevant for this education piece is what's called an employee stock ownership plan. This is an alternative for it's like usually a family-held company that wants to retire. That's usually what happens. And what happens is, instead of selling the company to another owner or to sell it to a big company, they're selling their ownership in the company to the employees, who usually pay back a type of loan. And in so doing, the company does become employee-owned. But it has to do with some nuance that I'm not going to get into in this video. But it's another structure similar to a cooperative. It's technically an employee-owned deal, but in the difference, and the main thing that I would say is the main difference is the founders end up making a ton of money in this type of process, which there's nothing wrong with making money. But if you're comparing the consciousness you can bring as a consumer, investor, or laborer to your decision making, and you have a company that didn't make the founder super rich, but that founder gave up all their wealth to create outcomes that are good for everyone, compared to a company that became employee-owned, but the employees had to buy at a high price the shares from the founders. Good example of that, you guys can Google this, is New Belgium Brewing. They were touted to be 100% employee-owned. The founder of that company sold all of her shares to the employees, I want to say 10 years ago. While that seems like it's a great thing, I want to say the value for that founder was several $100 million. And recently, New Belgium Brewing has had to sell the entire company to, I want to say, a Japanese conglomerate. And this was done, and what you see in this whole transaction is that the employees actually didn't make any money, and the people who actually won in this financial transaction was still the founder, who walked away with hundreds of millions of dollars. The employees bought into a company at the height of its growth. And so when they had no more growth in the craft beer segment, they needed to find some way to service their debt, which was largely produced through this ESOP transaction, and it created outcomes which I don't like economically. Just to be level-headed with you, I myself, as the founder of this company, have resolved to not extract that type of wealth from the productive value of this entity, and I've lived by the motto, it's better to give than it is to receive. So, not the biggest fan of ESOPs, but if you are in the marketplace looking to put your labor, investment, or consumer dollars somewhere, I prefer you buy from an ESOP or a cooperative or a B corporation versus, say, a traditional C corporation. Now, that having been said, let me tell you about what is happening with FruitCraft, with our corporation. And it is basically the founder shares of the corporation are being rolled into a trust. And all of the remaining shares that we got, or that we issued because we sold shares in our company to investors, they're an independent part of what we're talking about when we talk about ownership. But keep in mind, all of those other shareholders have no voting shares. They've got no say in how the business operates or anything at all, which means as we roll the founder shares into this trust, 100% of the control and the voting shares of the company will live within this trust. Quick little education piece about trusts. Trusts are these really weird financial holdings and instruments that are normally used to pass down wealth without naming an exact inheritor. I guess my point is, when you have like a family trust, for example, you might have 10 kids, and all 10 of those kids would be added on as beneficiaries to that trust. But if all 10 of those kids died and you could replace them with their grandkids and put new beneficiaries on, essentially what it does is it transfers the ownership of business into future generations without tax consequences, because otherwise there would be a transaction where ownership goes from the father to the son, and they got to pay all this money as a result of that. So, trusts have been formed really to be like safe havens for the super wealthy, but because they are blank slates and the way that you put your wording into the trust dictates everything about it, they become a ripe ground for us to start a new agreement, a new logic, a new engineering, so that those trust documents will then supersede and inform our corporate governance, so that the rights of employees, consumers, investors, and founders are all interwoven and intertwined into what would be the decision-making body of the company. So what are those classes of beneficiaries? Keeping in mind that when a new class of beneficiary is created, different benefits are going to be attributed to it. Case in point, in rolling up all of my shares into this trust, I will be a new type of beneficiary. I will be a founder beneficiary. And the type of rights I have are going to be different than the type of rights everybody else have. Of course, that's because I have given up all of my wealth in this process, so I deserve a little bit of say as to what happens here, right? But the truth of the matter is, I'm going to be there to protect the vision and the goal and the outcome of the social value enterprise business model. I'm not looking for personal gain. I'm looking to protect the long-term vision of this company. So the other beneficiaries, I've mentioned them in the previous 3 videos. We will have employee owner beneficiaries. We need to write into the trust documents what that means, what kind of benefits they get. We need to do the same thing with consumer owners, for member owners. There's going to be different relationship between member owners and that trust as well, as there will be with investors. So, these different classes of beneficiaries are our task. That is our goal in the coming videos, and this is why I talk about participatory economic activism. These videos are not here to bore you to death. These videos are here to invite you into something you never had any say in before. These videos are here to invite you to participate in creating a more beautiful world our hearts know is possible, and I know that together we can come up with the most perfect solution to these situations to create an economy that works for everyone. I will end this video with a historic thought process I have, and that is, I feel a lot like this is the Constitutional Convention, right? If you know U.S. history, you know that there came a point in time where America was frustrated by the overlording of England, and in that angst, they got together and said, what would it look like to create a government by the people and for the people? And so they literally re-engineered everything, and they wrote a democracy, and more important, a constitution with amendments and all the things that we know of to provide for our rights, our freedoms, and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so that is the moment we are in now. That is what I'm inviting you into. This is the Constitutional Convention of corporate governance, of creating new bylaws and new amendments that can help us create an economy that works for everyone. And so, please participate if you can. Engage in this content, subscribe to our YouTube channel, comment, share, do anything you can, because I need as many voices and as many ideas as I can get to make it so that we create a more perfect union. So as always, we'll end this video with remember to do good and to share with others. Cheers.